Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Igbopedia. I am your host, Chisom, and my special guest today is Okechukwu Nzelu. He is a writer and teacher, and his debut novel is called The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney. It's a story about youth, race, sexuality, and belonging. This novel recently won a Betty Trask Award and was shortlisted for the Betty Trask Prize, the Desmond Elliott Prize, and the Polari First Book Prize. Okechukwu was born in Manchester and read English at Girton College, Cambridge University. I'm really happy and excited to have him on the show today. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's so lovely to be here on a show where somebody can pronounce my name properly. This is fantastic.
That is funny. Yeah, no, it's great to have you on. And actually, I was going to say it's great to see an Igbo name in the title of a book. So I'm sure we'll have a great discussion and lots to unpack here about the book, but also about your life. So let's begin with your latest published work, titled The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney. It is best described as a funny and tender tribute to community, faith, and forgiveness, to growing up and to growing into ourselves. Could you give us a brief plot summary?
Yeah, so the novel revolves mainly around Nnenna, as you say, who is about to turn 17, and she lives in Manchester with her mother, Joni, who is white, English, and she's never met her father, and she doesn't know why. And as she starts to grow up, she's about to turn 17, she starts asking these questions about her father and about her heritage, and she starts sort of learning Igbo, which she's never learned or really heard before. And this makes her once quite tender and warm relationship with her mother much more strained, because her mother doesn't really want to discuss what happened with her father. There's a big mystery surrounding it. So the novel is really, it's about the two of them learning about themselves and about each other. And we learn about them as well through flashbacks to Joni's past with Nnenna's father, who she met when she was at university. And we see their love story develop and grow and eventually fall apart. And the novel is also, in a secondary way, the story of a host of other characters in Manchester, the friends and lovers of the mother and daughter.
Yeah, it's a great book, and thank you for that plot summary. Who or what was your inspiration for the central character, Nnenna Maloney?
That's a good question. At first, the story, I didn't really want to write it as it was now. I went through a series of different drafts and evolutions, and at first, I wanted to write just about teenagers. So I wanted to write about Nnenna and her friendship group primarily. And then I thought, really, I want to write about Nnenna, just her and her mother much more. So it kind of evolved, I suppose, out of a fascination that I have with that journey of self-discovery. Although Nnenna's story is not my own, I think like a lot of people, or like a lot of Igbo people who live here and who are born here in Britain, I can really relate to that story of kind of learning about yourself through your own sort of journey and figuring out your history and language, because of course it's not taught in school. And so you have to do the library work, you have to buy the books, listen to the podcasts, you have to do your own sort of research and figure it all out for yourself. And that can be really quite a difficult and lonely private thing. So I wanted to write about that sort of journey.
And whilst you tackle quite very deep subjects, as I described before, and you just mentioned now, so identity, belonging, race, youth, etc., the book actually begins very interestingly with a farcical intro. And that's also what I really love. Just talk us through the methods that you use and why you chose to start starts with such a farcical introduction to a very serious book.
Yeah, I'm really glad you enjoyed that. I love comedy. I love farce, especially at university. I did a bit of acting, and I acted in a few farces that really just stayed with me, I guess. I love the idea that everything can seem completely chaotic, and then out of that chaos can emerge something really serendipitous and beautiful. And I wanted to start the novel on that note of sort of almost a fateful meeting, because after that, as is no spoiler really, everything falls apart. Nnenna's parents meet in this bizarre way where the two of them are brought together from very different life experiences, and you would never expect them to meet, and they're in the middle of this farce, as you say, and then you would hope that out of that would perhaps come something quite blessed and quite solid. that was been brought together almost by the hand of God. But I wanted the reader to feel a bit bereft, actually, when the two characters, when the two parents' relationship doesn't work out the way that they're both wanting it to and both really trying to make it work out. I wanted to portray this sense that something has really been lost, that the rest of the novel is spent trying to figure out if it's possible to get back.
Excellent. Bernardine Evaristo, Booker Prize winner and author of Girl, Woman, Other. I'm going to just take a short quote of what she said about your book. So, Nzelu writes with a witty confidence rarely seen in debut fiction, smart, serious, and entertaining. I expect this book to have wide appeal and for the writer to go far. That is a pretty stellar endorsement. Describe the feeling of getting such a powerful endorsement from another successful writer for your debut novel as well.
I mean, it was wild. So I got the email from my publisher, Charmaine Lovegrove, who said, Bernardine Evaristo, she's a huge fan of Dialogue Books, the imprint that I'm published by, and she's written this quotation about you, and we're going to put it on the book. And I think I screamed. I screamed when I got the email, because I think she's just incredible. And, I love Girl, Woman, Other. I think it's just such an incredible book. And Bernardine Evaristo has been this amazing figure in literature for a long time, even before she won the Booker Prize. And so to have that praise from her, it's just incredible. It's just so incredible, and she's also somebody who, as it happens, has that sort of mixed race heritage, and so understands the journey that Nena goes on in a very real, personal way. So for her to praise that book was just incredible.
Yeah. No, I can only imagine the feeling. But does that also put some great expectations on your shoulders?
Yes. Yeah, I expect this writer to go far. No pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It does, but also in an amazing way, because I am ambitious for my writing. I want to write things that change people and that comfort people and provide companionship. I want my writing to do a lot, and there's a lot that I want it to do. So for her to say that is possible and that she expects my writing to go far it's a huge encouragement, as well as a kind of it's almost like saying, yep, keep going. I see what you're doing. Keep doing it. It's nice. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's great. Let's think about your literary heroes, or your favorite writer. Imagine a scenario where you're stuck in an elevator for half an hour with one of your literary heroes. Who would you pick to be stuck in an elevator with, and what would you discuss with them?
This is a really good question, and it's very, very difficult. If I had to be stuck with just one, that's difficult because there's so many writers that I love. But I think purely on the basis of a writer who is just really great to talk to, as well as being a really clever and really brilliant writer, I would say Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, because she's just so incredible. I've seen her speak a few times. I've met her once, actually, really briefly, after an event that she did at the Ilkley Literature Festival in Yorkshire a few years ago. And having seen her speak, as you know, she's just such a very smart, funny person. And I feel like somebody being stuck in an elevator with somebody like her would be less awful and traumatic than it would be with most other people. So yeah, I would choose her.
That's a great choice. Okay, you mentioned that there are many other people. Who else would be on your second list?
So many. Did they have to all be alive?
No, they can be deceased, actually.
Okay. I would choose James Baldwin. I feel like he would just be very I feel like he'd know what to do. Like, he'd sort the lift out pronto. Like, he'd know who to call. His mobile phone would be the only one that would have signal, and he would get it sorted. But also, who else would I choose? Zadie Smith. Again, she's just really, really funny. A writer called Dodie Smith as well, who I also love, if your listeners aren't familiar, she wrote 101 Dalmatians, but she also wrote this brilliant book called I Capture the Castle.
Yes.
And, you know it?
Yes, I've read that one actually when I was younger, yeah.
Yeah, me too. I read it when I was 14. I loved it. And I've read a little bit about her, and she just seems like this really funny person. And from the book, she seems really wise and knowing. And I think Wole Soyinka as well. Very
good choices. So let's move on to talk a little bit about your early life. You were born in Manchester, where the book is set actually, In the late 80s, your Igbo parents, just came to the UK. Tell us a bit more about your early life.
Yeah, so my parents they came over from Nigeria to the UK, as you say, in the 80s as part of what's now called the brain drain. This idea that because it was very hard and still is in Nigeria to find anything resembling a meritocracy, a lot of educated people came over from Nigeria to the UK or the US or other places to find a better life and a fairer life for themselves and their children. And one of the things, obviously, that the book deals with is the complexity of that you leave somewhere that is not treating you fairly, that, is corrupt in certain ways. And then, of course, you come to the West, where you encounter racism and all sorts of other fun things that you definitely don't want to see. So that was a complexity of how I grew up. I was raised to be very good at English, and look what happened. I was raised to be very good at English, in part because it was explicitly made clear to us by our parents that you have to be better at it than white English people. Otherwise, you will never get the opportunities that you deserve. And also, on top of that, I just always loved reading and stories and writing. Writing always felt very natural to me, and it always felt like this. It felt like the next step along from sort of being able to physically write words and sentences. So that was always a very early joy for me. And as was going to public libraries, we went to them sort of every weekend, and I loved it. It felt like this free space where I could explore different identities and experiences in a way that you can't really do in any other medium, or certainly I couldn't at that age. Maybe it's different now with streaming and things, but it just felt like this, like you were just set free into this wonderful world of choice and variety and experience. And I loved that. And I think from a very early age, I wanted to be part of that world and to be giving something back to it.
Oh, that's excellent. It sounds like your passion started at an early age. But what were the other influences of the Igbo or Nigerian culture on your childhood aspirations? Because I'm from an Igbo background, obviously. There is this strong sense of there are certain career paths that your parents expect you to choose. Yeah. So whilst they might nurture your writing, were they thinking doctor, lawyer, engineer, the typical things? Like, what was that like?
Definitely. I was never going to be a doctor because I'm just not very good at science. I worked very hard at school. I got good grades. But science was just never something that I displayed an inherent ability in. And I think that was obvious for anybody to see. I had to work very hard for the grades that I got in science and maths and stuff like that. So it was always going to be like, as we know, if you're Nigerian, there's a hierarchy and there's medicine at the top.
Yes.
Then law, then maybe engineering or something else that is like professional and very easy to see. I think what attracts a lot of Nigerians to it is the idea that it's quite hard to discriminate against somebody based on their results and the work that they do. If you are in these professions, right. The idea that if you're a doctor, if somebody gets better under your watch, that's it. Then they can't say it. It's very hard to work race into that, I suppose, as a theory. And so that was made very clear to me. I remember when I told my mum that I wanted to study English at university, it was like, honestly, it was like hammering out a nuclear arms treaty, like having these like meetings, like this, you got to have a plan, you got to do this, and then I'm going to do a law conversion course, which of course in the end I didn't do, and it was difficult. It was a long series of long conversations, being able to sort of negotiate the career that I wanted, and that I understand where that concern comes from, because being a writer is not, for most people, a financially reliable job as your only job. And it's not my only job. I'm a high school teacher as well. So for me, I get that. But at the same time, there was a kind of nurturing of my writing, I think, which sort of sat alongside that in a way that might seem quite bizarre. I must have been about 10 years old when my dad gave me a copy of Things Fall Apart. And I remember him saying to me, you want to be a writer, then you need to read this. And he just gave it to me and walked out of the room. I was like,
the goal has been set.
The goal had been set. And, that's fun. On the one hand, that is, pressure and expectation. I tried reading the book, but I wasn't old enough at like 9 or 10 years old to understand it at all, because it's a rich and complex narrative. But I didn't read it until I was much, much older. And, there was that pressure. But at the same time, I think Achebe's work has been so powerful and influential. And you know that because if a Nigerian parent is saying, you want to be a writer and not throwing that idea out of the door, that is some impact, right? Like that is the influence of a major writer.
Yeah.
If you can convince a Nigerian parent that writing is a career that their children might potentially be able to do even part-time.
And you made it into Cambridge University, studying your English degree. What was it like? Because obviously Cambridge is not the most diverse, racially diverse environment. And there's been a lot of press recently about the relatively low proportion of Black and ethnic minority students at the university. Same goes for Oxford, same goes for the Ivy League universities. Describe your experience at Cambridge University and the role that race plays in education.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It was not a diverse place. Ethnically, I've come from Manchester, specifically South Manchester. Like I grew up in Russia. I went to school in Russia, which is a very diverse ethnically part of Manchester, which is a diverse city. So to go from that to Cambridge, which is, mostly white, lots of people who've come from London, it was a bit of a shock to the system. I remember I was the ethnic minorities rep on my sort of JCR, the student council. And one of my sort of jobs was to throw a party for a sort of a cultural festival for something that that represented a minority ethnic group in the student body. And I chose Diwali, and it was surprising to me how many people just didn't know what it was. And I thought, how strange, like we were taught about that in school because there were so many different religions and beliefs around us that of course you would learn about Diwali because, this person sitting on that table celebrates Diwali with their family and it makes sense to. But then I went to this place where not only was there such a lack of difference in front of me, but so many of the people that I'd encountered had themselves not really encountered a lot of difference in their own lives up until that point. So, and that, on the one hand, I think because I choose my friends very, very carefully, the people that I spent a lot of time with were very great and did have those experiences and were open-minded and were, and self-educated and all those things. But a lot of the time, a lot of the people I remember on the sort of the hinterland, on the sort of the periphery of my experience, I remember certain things being said and done that were dodgy at best and outright racist at worst. I remember being at a house party very early on and explaining to somebody, and someone was sort of talking to me about, this is a white person talking to me about their gap year that they spent in Kenya and then saying, oh yeah, Kenya's, it's a really troubled country, lots of corruption. I was like, oh, okay, well, my parents are from Nigeria. And they cut me off to be like, just carry on explaining about the 1 year that they paid to spend in Kenya. And I was like, okay, so this is where I am. I think of that as a kind of defining moment of a lot of the racism problems that I encountered in Cambridge. But I think because my own sort of personal friendship group was quite small and very selective, it meant that I don't know, a lot of my experience, a lot of my memories of Cambridge are really, really positive. So I really wanted to reflect, I guess, both sides of that in the book I was writing.
So it sounds like you found your own tribe, or you created your own tribe within Cambridge. I'd like to explore a little bit what role the university, or not, well, generally, what role teachers can have in terms of levelling the playing field a little bit for Black students. Because you're currently, as you said, a high school teacher. First of all, why did you choose to become a teacher? And what do you think your role now can be, having gone through the education experience as a minority student?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to discuss, isn't it? And that's been so topical, especially right now. I originally didn't want to be a teacher. I remember when I was at school, like being a teacher was like my worst nightmare job, which is probably true for like most 16-year-olds. I was like, oh, teacher, no. And before I was a teacher, I worked in publishing for a few years for this lovely poetry press in Manchester called Carcanet Press. And that was a really lovely experience that I had. And I met lots of people that I really admired, and I read lots of things I wouldn't ordinarily have read. But by the end of those 3 years, I thought, I'm not sure that this is something I want to do forever. And so I was thinking, what can I do next? I really love my degree. I want to stay with English. I want to keep that, but I'm not sure that publishing is for me. And then I thought, of course, teaching. It seemed just like the natural next step. I really wanted to do something that made me feel like I was doing something that mattered and that was having an impact on the people directly in front of me. And I wanted to stay with my degree, as I said, and I wanted to do like a more people-facing job. A lot of the publishing law that I was in, certainly, was very computer-based, and I wanted something very interpersonal. And so teaching, that is exactly what it is. It's a very, very difficult job, but it is a job that allows you to really impact people and to, influence people for the better and be a really positive presence in people's lives. Especially now, specifically to do with, the discussion around decolonizing the curriculum, which I don't think I remember hearing when I was at university. I don't know about you.
No, I didn't.
No, I don't remember hearing that when I was at university either. So it seems like a fairly new thing, which is, it's a fantastic thing. And it's, we have to work within the exam, what the exam boards, the choices that the exam boards give us. I teach English. That means, the poems and the novels and the plays that I teach, I have to prepare the students for the exam. So we have to work within those choices. So there's a larger conversation to be had there. But then on the outside of that, we can also, all English teachers, I think, try and give their students a pretty broad diet of things to read and experience so that they can discuss and access a lot more things. And I think that's really important. It's part of it's what they're entitled to. I think the students that we're teaching deserve that really broad diet of literature. Otherwise, I think they're being shortchanged.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And like you said, I hadn't, at secondary school or university, I did not hear anything about decolonizing the curriculum. But now it's the first step because it's being taught about. So that's the first step in the right direction. How it's done obviously needs to be discussed quite carefully. But I think it's really important for people because the world is becoming more diverse and it's important to have that knowledge at an early stage in life. Definitely.
I think that, especially at that early stage in life, that's when students are really curious about these things. They're interested in people whose lives are not necessarily the same as theirs or people whose lives they don't see necessarily reflected in the media so often. So I think it's great, and I've been fortunate enough to teach no longer at ease actually to a couple of GCSE classes, which has been fantastic. And I'm teaching Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun right now to my sixth formers, which is just it's wonderful to be able to give these wonderful works of literature to students, especially knowing that they might not encounter them otherwise. It really does make you feel like you're doing something that really matters.
So let's create a hypothetical scenario. You have a dinner party at your home and you can invite 3 guests, living or deceased. Which ones would they be?
This is another really good question. So I think my first one would be Afra Ben, who was an English playwright in the Restoration period. And also, I think it's more or less confirmed that she was a spy. So I feel like she would just have a lot of interesting conversation and she'd know a lot of stuff that she wasn't supposed to know. So she would be really fun. I would invite Lorraine Hansberry because she died young. I think she was only like 36 when she died, not much older, definitely. But she just did so much in her life. Her parents were involved in the NAACP. She wrote this amazing play. She was, she knew theatre. She knew this incredibly powerful medium and she knew all these incredible people. I think she'd be really good. And my third person, who's also dead, would be, it's going to sound like I just don't want to talk to anybody who's still alive. Zora Neale Hurston, whose novel That Eyes Are Watching God I just love. Again, because she had this incredibly fascinating life and full of exciting things, and she knew all kinds of interesting people like Langston Hughes, and she had that friendship with him that was very interesting. And yeah, I feel like all these 3 people, they would have lots of interesting things to say, and I feel like we just have a really good time.
Yes, it sounds great. And yeah, interesting you chose 3 deceased people. But, at the end of the day, if you ever have a chance to meet someone, it's good to meet people who aren't currently around.
Exactly. I'm not sure which one of us would be doing the cooking, but, we'll figure that out.
You could get Deliveroo.
Yes.
Let's switch to talking about the private joys of Nena Maloney. There's so much in this book that I'd love to unpack. So I'll talk about it. We'll split up or break up our discussion into some key themes. But firstly, what I loved about the book is that whilst it's heartwarming and often humorous, it does cover these really complex issues and very topical subjects, from religion to family, identity, race, sexuality, gender, class, etc. It's like you put everything into this book. But you did so in a really, really good way, as I said, with humour as well at times. You also explored how stigmatization happens across various segments of society. So, right, let's talk. The first topic I would like to explore with you is intersectionality. First of all, it would be great if you gave us a brief summary of what this actually means. But let's talk about the character of Jonathan, because he is Black and queer.
Yeah, so intersectionality is a term which I'm hearing much more often than I did a few years ago, certainly. Invented by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, I think in the 80s, which refers to how the belonging to different sort of oppressed or marginalized groups can compound one's experience of being oppressed or marginalized in ways that are different from simply belonging to one of those groups. So the obvious example is to be a Black woman. You know, you experience racism and you experience misogyny in a way that is different from somebody who only experiences one of those things at a time. And in the novel, for Jonathan, who, as you say, is a gay Black man, he is somebody who is really struggling with his mental health, partly because of the way that his queerness and his Blackness are oppressed in the society in which he lives. He is at a time in his life, when in sort of late 30s, when a lot of men lose their friendships and a lot of men simply struggle to make new ones. So that's certainly part of it. But he's also struggling with the fact that the gay community is very racist. And he's struggling with the fact that he has to have his chosen family. This is a sort of term that we love to exalt, this idea that you have friends who will be like your family, but then there's an instability there that he falls foul of. He doesn't have parents and siblings who are this sort of permanent support network for him that is unconditional. And because of that, he suffers from loneliness, which causes him to make choices which are not always in his own best interests, which is partly why he ends up dating somebody who is, well, dating is a loose word for what they're doing, but he ends up sort of...
Entanglement.
An entanglement. Outstanding. Yes, an entanglement. Jada would be so proud. With this person who's really bad for him, who treats him really badly. And he really has to do a lot of work around his own self-esteem before he can reckon with that without giving too much away.
Yeah, I'm trying to be careful of not giving any spoilers here. But the theme of religion kind of runs throughout your book. So every chapter begins with a quote from a biblical verse, often the book of Job. But I want to explore that a little bit, because Jonathan, as you say, he's not quite welcomed. He's part of a religious group at university. And that's partly what is stopping him from being fully accepted into that community, because they are rejecting, or there's one particular character that told him some very, very harsh words in a church, actually, which kind of kicked off a series of negative experiences for him. But yeah, let's talk, why did you choose religion, and why did you choose to kind of interweave that in every chapter, starting with a quote?
For me, it was really part of my own experience in a lot of ways. I grew up in the Church of England. My family went to church every Sunday, as lots of Nigerian and lots of Igbo families will have done the same thing. And when I was about Nena's age, when I was about 16, I went from really devoutly believing in God to really struggling with that belief. And I couldn't square that belief with the world that I saw in front of me. You know, what we call the problem of evil, this idea that how can you have a benevolent God who loves humanity and also have so much needless, pointless suffering that a benevolent God could prevent or stop. And I couldn't get my head around those two things. I couldn't find myself a way to believe in God with that problem in front of me. And that was a really difficult thing for me. It was a really difficult period in my life in that sense, because I had to sort of not just go from believing in God to not believing in God, but I also had to figure out a whole new way of seeing life. You know, I'd grown up thinking that there was somebody in heaven watching everything I do, and suddenly that person disappeared, overnight. Yeah. And that really that was a really profound thing that I had to deal with. And so that's why I wanted to write that sort of journey in for Jonathan, who is struggling with that, and also for Morris, who is struggling, Nena's father, who she hasn't met. But, Morris is also struggling with exactly what he believes God to be and what God wants from him. And that was a really profound thing for me. Even though I don't believe in God anymore, I really wanted to, I couldn't help the fact that my sort of Christian upbringing really inflects the way that I see the world to this day. I can't say that I read the Bible every night or anything like that, but I still have a really profound connection to certain elements of the Bible, like the book of Job, which is just this incredibly beautifully written, frustrating story of what happens when somebody does sort of start to lose their faith, and then God's response to that, which is typically frustrating, enigmatic. And I wanted to sort of write that journey and that struggle, because it was something that I knew from really personally.
Yeah, excellent. Let's switch over to Nena, actually, and the kind of topics you discuss and describe for her character. So race and identity is one. And she is someone who's not quite comfortable in her own skin. Let's talk a little bit about that, and also race in relation to her father's experience at the time as an immigrant, essentially, in Cambridge.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed writing this dual narrative, because on the one hand, we've got Nena, who is about to turn 17, and on the one hand, she's got a very firm identity as a very intellectually, academically successful person who's got a really bright future ahead of her. The novel kicks off partly when her teacher tells her that she could study at the Sorbonne in Paris, and that she's got the ability to do that, and she should be excited. So on the one hand, her future is mapping itself out for her really nicely and really neatly. On the other hand, there's still a huge amount that she doesn't know about herself and her father. And that for her, it kind of undermines the plans that she's making and the excitement that she's got about her life. So I really enjoyed writing that sort of counterpoint. One of the things that kicks off her journey about learning Igbo is her boyfriend, Danny, who is white and nowhere near as clever as her, which I really enjoyed writing as well, because that is a really interesting power dynamic. The fact that on the one hand, he's male and white and she is neither of those things. And yet all of his friends think that he's sort of like punching above his weight, because Nena is this incredibly gorgeous, clever person, and he is kind of average or seen as such by his friends. And so the story kicks off when he's kind of feeling pretty bitter about that and says to her, I can't believe you're so good at French, but you don't speak your own language. And this is the start of her journey for herself, because she doesn't know how to respond to that. She doesn't have an answer to it. She doesn't, she hears comments like that or other sort of comments which are more straightforwardly racist, and she doesn't know how to respond. She's never had those conversations with her parents about it the way that Morris has with his parents. She doesn't have that grounding, and she also doesn't feel like she knows enough about herself. And so her journey throughout the novel is partly one of figuring out her history and her language. She connects with her culture first and foremost by language, because that's what she's good at. That's the way her brain works. She's a very, very good linguist. And so for her, it's a journey of being prepared to meet the world that she lives in, and being prepared to answer the questions that people are asking of her, but which she doesn't feel empowered enough to ask of her mother, or connected enough to ask of her father.
So that's a nice segue into the family theme, because Nena's relationship with her mother Joni is quite strained. Whilst they live together and it's just been the two of them in the relationship, they have boundaries quite firmly, and Nena is often too scared to breach the boundaries, too scared to ask the questions, which is in part why she's doing this research about her background herself, even though her mother would probably be able to, or in theory could provide the answers. So let's talk a bit about that family dynamic.
Yeah, one of the things that is great about being published by Charmaine and my publisher is that she just got the story straight away. And I remember she summed it up really well by this element of it really well by saying, Joni is her daughter's biggest champion, but also in some ways her biggest obstacle. And I think that's true. The two of them at first, in some ways they have a really close and tender relationship, which I also enjoyed writing because it was a huge act of imagination for me. Nena's relationship with her mother is one which is partly conditioned by the fact that they both grew up in the same country. So they have a lot